Today, we're going to explore selfishness as a form of fear disguised as confidence. Welcome to our channel, Egopedia.
Selfishness as a form of fear disguised as self-confidence. Selfish behavior is often interpreted as a manifestation of self-confidence, independence, or self-assuredness. However, closer psychological examination reveals that many acts of selfishness may, in fact, be defensive strategies rooted in fear, particularly fear of vulnerability, rejection, scarcity, or loss of control. This paper examines the cognitive and emotional mechanisms by which fear disguises itself as confidence through selfish behavior. Drawing from ego defense theory, attachment models, trauma psychology, and social narrative construction, we argue that what appears to be confident self-prioritization may often be a form of avoidance or protective reactivity. The paper explores how fear-based selfishness mimics confidence, its consequences for interpersonal dynamics, and how to distinguish true self-assurance from fear-disguised egoism. Selfishness is often valorized under the language of empowerment. I'm just setting boundaries. I know my worth. I choose me. Such statements are commonly interpreted as signals of emotional maturity and self-confidence. However, a deeper psychological analysis suggests a troubling ambiguity. Many of these behaviors, while presented as empowered, are actually reactive rather than proactive. They stem not from grounded confidence, but from fear. Fear of being hurt, exploited, exposed, or dependent. This paper explores the proposition that much of what we call confidence-driven selfishness is actually fear in disguise. It examines how fear adopts the aesthetic and language of empowerment in order to shield the self from perceived threats, loss, or vulnerability. The goal is not to vilify selfishness, but to illuminate the emotional realities it sometimes conceals. Certainly. Here's an expanded and detailed version of Section 2, Literature Review for the theme. Selfishness as a form of fear disguised as self-confidence. Literature Review. Unmasking the psychological architecture of selfishness. Understanding selfishness as a defense mechanism rooted in fear and often misinterpreted as confidence requires examining a broad spectrum of psychological literature. This section explores how scholars and researchers across multiple disciplines have conceptualized selfish behavior, its underlying emotional drivers, and the ego constructs that mask vulnerability beneath apparent strength. Rather than viewing selfishness as a simple character flaw, modern psychological theories increasingly interpret it as a coping strategy developed to manage perceived emotional threats. Below are the key frameworks and findings that shape this perspective. Classical perspectives, selfishness, and ego defense mechanisms. Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory laid the foundation for understanding how unconscious fears shape behavior. He posited that individuals deploy ego defense mechanisms, such as denial, projection, and rationalization, to protect the self from anxiety or perceived inadequacy. Selfish behavior, in this context, can be seen as a form of defense against feelings of powerlessness or insignificance. Later, Anna Freud elaborated on these mechanisms, identifying reaction formation, the act of expressing the opposite of one's true feelings, as a common tactic. This could manifest as overconfident posturing to conceal deep-seated fears of rejection or unworthiness. Humanistic psychology, the fear of not being enough. Humanistic psychologists like Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow offered a more compassionate lens. Rogers emphasized the need for unconditional positive regard and how its absence can lead to self-protective behaviors. In a world where people feel they must earn acceptance, selfishness often becomes a survival strategy. If I don't put myself first, no one else will. Maslow's hierarchy of needs also helps contextualize selfishness. Those stuck at the lower rungs, safety, belonging, may exhibit self-centered behaviors not because of narcissism, but because of unmet psychological needs. Maslow recognized that fear of scarcity, emotional or material, often precedes what looks like selfishness. Contemporary research on fear, insecurity, and narcissism. In recent decades, research has increasingly focused on the link between fear and narcissistic behavior, particularly in the field of personality psychology. A vulnerable narcissism, as defined by Wink, 1991, refers to individuals who appear arrogant or self-absorbed but are, in fact, deeply insecure and hypersensitive to criticism. This type of narcissism often presents as superficial confidence, masking profound fear of inadequacy. Studies by Pincus and Lukowitsky, 2010, suggest that many people labeled as selfish or egotistical are reacting to low self-worth, attachment anxiety, or emotional invalidation. Their selfishness is not an expression of abundance, but of emotional scarcity. Baumeister et al., 1996, found that threatened egotism, when one's self-image is unstable, leads to more aggressive and self-serving behaviors than stable, authentic self-esteem. In other words, people who need to constantly assert their importance often do so because they feel invisible or undervalued at a deeper level. Trauma, shame, and the armor of selfishness. Trauma literature, particularly in the works of Bessel van der Kolk and Gabor Mate, offers a compelling explanation for the roots of selfishness as emotional armor. Gabor Mate describes how early emotional wounds, especially those involving shame, abandonment, or neglect, can lead individuals to develop compensatory egos that appear confident but are actually designed to protect a fragile sense of self. Shame, as described by Brené Brown, is a powerful silencer that often fuels defensive behaviors. People who are ashamed of their needs, fears, or vulnerabilities may overcompensate by acting in ways that appear dominant, disinterested, or selfish. Trauma survivors often operate from a hypervigilant nervous system, perceiving others as threats and over-prioritizing self-protection. Their so-called selfishness is more accurately a fight-or-flight survival response, not a moral failing. Evolutionary and social psychology, adaptive versus maladaptive selfishness. From an evolutionary perspective, self-interest is not inherently negative. Self-preservation is a biological imperative. However, social psychology distinguishes between adaptive selfishness, setting boundaries, self-care, and maladaptive selfishness, dominating, exploiting, or isolating. A research by Batson, 1991, shows that true altruism exists but often competes with egoistic motivations, especially when individuals fear loss of control or status. The concept of social reciprocity, Trivers, 1971, explains how cooperation evolved alongside selfishness, suggesting that imbalanced selfishness disrupts the relational systems that humans naturally depend on for survival. Thus, extreme selfishness is not only emotionally dysfunctional, it is socially unsustainable. The psychological literature paints a complex picture. What we often call selfishness is not simply arrogance or entitlement, but frequently a defense against fear, shame, and unmet needs. Across psychoanalysis, trauma research, personality theory, and evolutionary psychology, a consensus emerges. Selfishness is often a mask, worn not out of malice, but out of emotional necessity. Understanding this truth does not excuse toxic behavior, but it does invite empathy, not just for others, but also for the frightened, hidden parts of ourselves. Fear disguised as self-confidence, mechanisms and manifestations. At the surface, selfish behavior often presents as confidence. People assert their needs, speak decisively, set firm boundaries, and prioritize themselves. But beneath this surface, what appears to be self-assurance is frequently rooted in fear of rejection, inadequacy, loss of control, emotional dependence, or abandonment. This section examines the internal psychological mechanisms that allow fear to masquerade as confidence and the real-world behaviors in which this pattern typically manifests. Psychological mechanisms: how fear rewires the self. Selfishness is rarely born from malice. More often, it is a coping adaptation that grows from emotional pain. To understand how fear takes on the mask of confidence, we need to explore several cognitive emotional processes. Ego armor and inflated persona. The ego, as described in many psychological traditions, serves to protect the self from harm, not just physical but emotional harm. When fear dominates an individual's internal world, the ego may construct a false self that appears powerful, detached, or hyper-independent. This inflated persona acts as armor to avoid vulnerability. The person seems fearless, but is actually afraid to rely on others. They appear dominant, but are terrified of being overlooked or disrespected. They act entitled, but fear not being good enough to be loved without proving something. This persona becomes a shield, confidence on the outside, anxiety on the inside. Emotional overcompensation. Emotional overcompensation is a form of psychological balancing where a person reacts in exaggerated opposition to their inner fears. If someone feels powerless, they might assert control in every interaction. If they fear not being enough, they may overstate their value or dismiss others to protect their image. Examples include bragging or name-dropping to mask self-doubt, controlling conversations to avoid confronting unfamiliar emotional territory, prioritizing personal wins in relationships or teams to feel relevant. This behavior is not confidence, it is anxious self-preservation. Detachment as a safety strategy. When people are afraid of emotional entanglement, they may feign detachment or disinterest. This often looks like selfishness. I do what's best for me. People need to take care of themselves. I don't owe anyone an explanation. If I don't put myself first, who will? These mantras often mask a deep-seated fear of emotional dependency or the pain of previous betrayals. The detachment is not genuine indifference. It is a learned defense. Preemptive self-priority. Some individuals prioritize themselves so aggressively because they believe that no one else ever will. This belief, often internalized from childhood or past trauma, can lead to a preemptive form of selfishness. They take before others offer. They speak before others are heard. They retreat before anyone gets too close. In their mind, being selfish is a form of emotional insurance, a guarantee that they won't be left empty or abandoned. Real-world manifestations. What this pattern looks like in life. Now that we've examined the psychological roots, let's look at how this fear and confidence clothing plays out in everyday life. These are the patterns and behaviors people often observe in those they label selfish, but with a more compassionate lens, we can begin to see the fear underneath. Dominating conversations and spaces. A person who constantly centers themselves in conversations may not be trying to steal attention out of arrogance, but because they fear being forgotten or unseen. They might interrupt, redirect topics, or talk over others, not because they think they're more important, but because their self-worth is externally validated by being heard. Avoiding vulnerable reciprocity. People who appear independent and self-sufficient may avoid emotional intimacy. They share little about themselves, deflect vulnerability, and expect others to deal with their issues alone. This is not necessarily a lack of empathy. It is often a fear of being too dependent, too exposed, or too emotionally entangled to survive. Hyper-individualism in relationships. In friendships or romantic partnerships, this person may insist on doing things their way, avoid compromise, or seem emotionally unavailable. They may push away others' needs as too much, disappear during emotional conflict, resist emotional caregiving roles. This behavior is often a sign that closeness feels threatening. To protect themselves, they maintain distance, and selfishness becomes their strategy. Achievement addiction and self-centered identity. Another form of fear masked as confidence appears in achievement-focused individuals who tie their identity to success, power, or image. They may seem ambitious and self-assured, but deep down, they fear irrelevance. They fear stillness because it invites introspection. They measure their worth by what they do, not who they are. This often leads to neglecting others' emotional realities, because those realities feel like distractions from their fragile sense of purpose. Justifying selfishness with boundaries. In modern discourse, there's a risk that people confuse self-centered behavior with healthy boundaries. Individuals struggling with fear may co-opt the language of self-care and empowerment to avoid deeper emotional work. For example, "I'm protecting my energy" may mask fear of emotional accountability. "I own nothing to anyone" may signal fear of being needed or trapped. While boundaries are healthy, when rooted in fear, they can become walls rather than bridges. What often appears as confidence, independence, or assertiveness may in truth be a survival mask forged by fear. These behaviors are not expressions of emotional strength, but rather symptoms of emotional fragility hidden behind polished armor. By understanding the underlying psychological mechanisms, ego defense, overcompensation, fear of vulnerability, we begin to recognize that what we call selfishness is sometimes just a cry for safety in disguise. The invitation, then, is not to excuse selfishness, but to decode it. And in doing so, we open the door not only to deeper empathy, but also to more meaningful growth for ourselves and for those we once dismissed as merely self-absorbed. Discussion: the ethics of perception. Why it matters. Mislabeling fear-driven selfishness as confidence has both personal and societal consequences. It inhibits personal growth, as the individual remains trapped in reactive, defended behavior while believing they are self-actualizing. It erodes relational depth, as others may sense inauthenticity or manipulation. It obscures real confidence, which is characterized not by reactivity, but by emotional openness, resilience, and generosity. By conflating fear-based egoism with self-assurance, we reward avoidance and punishment aversion rather than courage. Toward transformative self-awareness. If selfishness is often fear in disguise, what is the remedy? The answer lies in emotional introspection, compassionate self-confrontation, and relational courage. Individuals must ask, am I setting this boundary from strength or from fear? Am I choosing myself because I value myself, or because I don't trust others? Is my selfishness a short-term relief from anxiety or a long-term expression of integrity? These questions cultivate differentiated self-awareness, the ability to hold one's needs while also understanding the emotional forces shaping behavior. Selfishness is not always the result of narcissism or entitlement. Often, it is fear, dressed up in the clothes of confidence. It is a mask, a posture, a psychological adaptation to past wounds or unmet needs. But when fear drives behavior, no matter how articulate or empowered it appears, it leads to disconnection, stagnation, and moral self-deception. Recognizing fear beneath selfishness does not mean rejecting the need for self-prioritization. Rather, it invites a deeper inquiry. Is this truly who I am at my best, or who I've become in response to what I fear? The goal is not to eliminate selfishness, but to unmask it, understand its origins, and redirect it into authentic self-respect, one that neither hoards nor abandons, but chooses with clarity and courage.